I never thought the person who would try to take everything from me was someone I had spent 31 years loving more than my own life. I was 67 years old when my son sat down across from me at my own kitchen table, folded his hands the way he always did when he wanted something, and told me I needed to be realistic about the future. I remember the morning clearly. It was October, and the maple tree in my backyard had turned that deep copper color I always loved. I had been drinking my coffee by the window, watching the leaves fall, feeling that particular kind of peace that comes when you've built a life you're genuinely proud of. Then I heard his car pull into the driveway, and something in my chest tightened before I even opened the door. My name is Dorothy Calloway. I am a retired school librarian. I spent 28 years helping children fall in love with books in a small elementary school outside Columbus, Ohio, and I can tell you from experience that the people who underestimate quiet women have never had one outsmart them. My husband, Gerald, passed away 4 years before any of this happened. A heart attack, fast and without warning, on a Tuesday morning in April. He was 63 years old and had just planted tomatoes in the garden. The grief nearly swallowed me whole that first year, but I found my footing again. I had my routines, my book club on Thursday evenings, my neighbor Carol who came over for tea more mornings than not, my garden, and the house Gerald and I had bought together in 1987 and filled with everything that mattered to us. That house was mine. I want to be clear about that. Gerald and I had paid off the mortgage 11 years before he died. The deed had both our names, and when he passed, the property transferred fully to me. My son knew this. He had known it his entire adult life. My son, I'll call him by his name. David had always been charming in the way that certain men learn to be when they figure out early that charm is a useful tool. He was good-looking, confident, the kind of person who filled a room when he walked in. I had loved that about him when he was a boy. I loved watching him grow into someone sure of himself. What I hadn't noticed, or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice, was when that confidence curdled into something else. Something that looked at the world and saw only what he could take from it, see away. His wife, Renee, was a different kind of problem. She was precise in the way of someone always calculating odds. She smiled at the right moments and said the right things, but her eyes were always somewhere else, always measuring. I had never fully trusted her, but I had accepted her because David loved her, or said he did, and because I believed that was enough reason. For the 2 years after Gerald died, David called every Sunday. He came to visit on holidays. He helped me fix the gutters one fall and told me he worried about me being alone in such a large house. I told him I was perfectly fine. I was. Then the calls started changing. Small things at first. He began mentioning that the house was a lot to maintain. He started referring to the neighborhood as not what it used to be, which was not true. It was exactly what it had always been. A quiet street with good neighbors and old trees. He brought up, more than once, that a woman my age, living alone, was a liability waiting to happen. I noticed each of these comments, but I filed them away without fully understanding what they were building toward. I found out on that October morning, David sat at my kitchen table with a manila folder in front of him. Renee stayed in the living room. I could hear her in there. And later, I understood why she kept her distance. She didn't want to be associated with what was about to happen. He told me he had been doing some research. He said that if I ever needed long-term care, the government could come after my assets, including the house, to recover Medicaid costs. He said he'd spoken to someone, a financial advisor, who told him the best way to protect the house was to transfer it to his name now, while I was healthy, so that when the time came, there would be nothing for anyone to take. He said this was called asset protection planning. He said it was very common. He said he just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were several documents, printed and tabbed with little sticky arrows, showing me where to sign. I looked at them. I looked at my son. He was watching me with that particular expression. Patient, slightly concerned, entirely rehearsed. I thought about something Gerald used to say. He said the fastest way to find out what someone really wants is to watch what they do when they think no one is paying attention. I had been paying attention for 2 years. I just hadn't wanted to believe what I was seeing. I asked David if I could have a few days to look everything over. He said, of course, absolutely, take all the time I needed. He was very relaxed about it. That relaxed quality was the most frightening thing he had shown me yet. After he left, I sat at the table for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Carol. Carol is 70 years old, sharper than anyone I have ever met, and she had been a paralegal for a family law firm for over 2 decades before she retired. When I explained what David had brought me, there was a silence on the other end of the line that told me everything I needed to know before she said a single word. Dorothy, she said, you need to call an estate attorney tomorrow morning. First thing, I did. Her name was Patricia Morse, and she had an office 20 minutes from my house. I brought the folder David had left me. I sat in her clean, orderly office and watched her read through every page. Her expression did not change while she read, which I appreciated. I didn't need her alarm. I needed her expertise. When she finished, she set the documents down and looked at me steadily. She told me that what David had brought me was not asset protection planning in any legitimate sense. Transferring a primary residence to a child's name outright, not into a trust, not through a Medicaid-compliant structure, but directly into his name did not protect me from anything. It protected him. If I signed those papers, the house would belong to my son. I would have no legal claim to it. I could be asked to leave. I would have given away everything Gerald and I had built together for nothing, based on a story constructed to sound like concern. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her what I should do. She told me about a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, a legitimate legal structure that would protect my house from future long-term care costs while keeping me as the beneficiary with the right to live there for the rest of my life. She said we could have it set up and the house transferred into the trust within 2 weeks. The trust would be irrevocable, meaning no one, including me, could simply undo it later, but it would preserve my home for my actual heirs, whoever I chose, under terms I controlled. I asked her what happened if my son pressed me to sign his documents before then. She smiled, not unkindly, and said, "That's entirely up to you. But I can tell you, Mrs. Calloway, that a signature on a fraudulent transfer under pressure may have certain legal implications for the person who prepared those documents." I drove home and I thought about my son, and the October maple in my backyard, and Gerald planting tomatoes, and 31 years of loving someone with everything I had. Then I called David and told him I had looked over the papers and I was ready to sign. He came back on a Saturday morning, 3 days later. She sat in the living room again while David settled in at the kitchen table. He had a pen ready. He was cheerful in a way that made me feel tired and sad and certain all at once. I signed where all the little sticky arrows pointed. David gathered the papers, tapped them into a neat stack, and slid them back into the folder. He put the folder in his bag. He told me he was proud of me for being sensible about this. He gave me a hug at the door and told me not to worry about anything. I watched his car pull out of my driveway. Then I went inside and called Patricia Morse to let her know it was time to move forward with the trust. What David did not know, what he could not have known, was that Patricia had already walked me through exactly which documents he had brought me and what they actually did. She had told me the transfer he was seeking required specific additional steps to be legally valid in Ohio. a notarized deed filed with the county recorder's office, a transfer tax declaration, and my signature witnessed by someone who could confirm I had not been under duress. David had none of that. He had pages I had signed in my kitchen on a Saturday morning with no witness, no notary, no recording. He had a folder full of paper. In the meantime, Patricia completed the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. 2 weeks after that Saturday morning, I signed the legitimate trust documents in her office, with a notary present. With Carol as my witness, the house was transferred into the trust. I remained the sole beneficiary with the right to live there for the remainder of my life. I was named the trustee. My designated successor was Carol's daughter, a woman I had known since she was 9 years old and who I trusted without reservation. My son had nothing. He did not know this yet. I heard from David in November, about 3 weeks after the Saturday signing. He called to tell me that he and Renee had been talking, and they thought it might be time to look into getting the house appraised, just to know what they were working with. He mentioned a real estate agent he knew. He asked if I would be comfortable having someone come walk through the house. I told him that sounded fine, and that I would be home on Thursday afternoon if the agent wanted to come by. The agent came on a Thursday. A pleasant woman who measured rooms and took photographs and asked me questions about the roof and the HVAC system, while David stood in the hallway looking at his phone. Renee did not come. The agent told me the house was in lovely condition. David thanked her and walked her out. He seemed, for the first time in months, genuinely happy. I watched him from the kitchen window as he stood on my front porch talking to the agent in the driveway. He was nodding, smiling, gesturing. I thought about all the Christmases we had spent in this house. I thought about the summer David was 12, and we put a tire swing in the backyard, and he spent every afternoon on it until September. I thought about how grief can make you miss a version of someone who may never have entirely existed. Then I went and made myself a cup of tea. It was Carol who suggested I speak to an attorney about the original documents David had brought me, not merely to protect myself going forward, but because what he had done carried its own legal weight. I was reluctant at first. He was my son. That fact did not stop being true simply because he had done something terrible. But Carol, who had spent 20 years watching families destroy themselves over property and money, looked at me across my kitchen table and said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Dorothy, you protecting him from the consequences of this is not the same thing as loving him." I sat with that for a long time. I called Patricia. What followed over the next several months was not a dramatic courtroom scene. It was paperwork and waiting, and phone calls and more paperwork. Patricia referred me to an elder law attorney named James Holloway, who specialized in financial exploitation cases. James was methodical and thorough and spoke to me like an adult, which I appreciated enormously. He explained that what David had done preparing documents designed to transfer a parent's primary residence under false pretenses, without proper legal formality, and through misrepresentation, constituted attempted financial exploitation of an elderly adult under Ohio law. The fact that the transfer had ultimately failed due to procedural deficiencies did not eliminate the attempt. James asked me a careful question. He asked whether I had any other evidence of David's intentions or of Renee's involvement. I had, as it turned out, quite a bit. I had saved every text message David had sent me over the prior 2 years. I had saved voicemails. I had notes I had written for myself. I had always kept notes, an old librarian habit with dates and what was said and who was present. I had the original documents he had brought me. I even had a text Renee had sent me the week before the Saturday signing, in which she mentioned they had already talked to someone about the listing, a real estate agent, before David had even finished convincing me to sign. They had listed the house before I had agreed to give it to them. They had been so certain I would comply that they had already begun the sale. James looked at that text message for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway." I think we have a fairly comprehensive picture here. The case did not go to a full criminal trial. David's attorney negotiated a resolution in which David and Renee were required to sign a legal agreement acknowledging that they had no claim to my property, that the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust was the legally valid instrument governing my home, and that any future attempt to contest or interfere with my estate would result in immediate civil litigation. David was also required to complete a financial exploitation diversion program, a condition of avoiding criminal charges, and to pay a portion of my legal fees. I sat in James Holloway's conference room the morning the agreement was signed. David sat across the table. He did not look like the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of our car, coming home from his grandmother's house. He looked like a man who had made a series of choices and arrived somewhere he had not expected. He did not look at me. I did not try to make him. When it was over, James walked me to my car. It was March by then, and still cold, but the kind of cold that had already decided to become something else. I could smell it in the air, that particular shift that means the ground is thinking about spring. James shook my hand and told me that in 22 years of practice he had worked with a lot of women in situations like mine, and that most of them had not been as prepared as I was. I told him I had spent 28 years teaching children that the most important thing you can do when something doesn't seem right is pay attention and ask questions. He laughed and said that was very good advice. I drove home on roads I had been driving for 30 years. I passed the grocery store where I had bought David's school lunches when he was small. I passed the park where Gerald used to take him on Saturday mornings so I could sleep in. I passed the church where we had celebrated everything worth celebrating in our family's life. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment before I went inside. The maple tree was still bare, but the forsythia along the fence had started putting out its first small buds, yellow and stubborn, and entirely unconcerned with anything that had happened over the past 5 months. I had planted that forsythia the year David was born. Gerald used to tease me that it was the least cooperative plant in the yard because it bloomed before everything else without waiting for permission. I went inside and put the kettle on. Carol came over that afternoon, the way she always did, and we sat in the kitchen and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved most about her. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" I thought about that question honestly, the way it deserved. I said that I was, not in the way that means you're pretending, or that the pain isn't real, or that you expect to feel exactly the same about someone on the other side of something like this as you did before it happened, but all right in the way that means you are still here, in your own kitchen, in your own house, with the forsythia starting up outside and a friend across the table who showed up, because that is what she does. I said that I thought Gerald would have been relieved. Carol smiled at that. She had known Gerald for 20 years, and she agreed he absolutely would have been. The house is still mine. The trust is still in place. I still have my book club on Thursday evenings, and my garden in the summer, and my copper maple in October. I still wake up in the house where I have lived for more than 30 years, and feel that peace I described at the beginning, the particular kind that comes from having built a life you are genuinely proud of. My son and I have not spoken since March. I do not know if we ever will. I have made my peace with not knowing. Love does not obligate you to stand still while someone takes everything you have. I learned that, or perhaps I always knew it, and only found the moment when I had to act on it. What I want anyone who hears this story to understand, especially any woman who is listening, any woman who has been made to feel that her age makes her a burden, or her independence is inconvenient, or her quiet makes her manageable, is this: quiet is not the same as compliant. Still water runs deep. And the women who have spent decades watching, paying attention, keeping notes, showing up, those women know exactly what they're doing when they finally decide it's time to act. I signed my son's papers on a Saturday morning in October. What I had already done the week before was something he never saw coming. And I was free.